Please look into this animation entitled The Holographic Theory of Everything, taking into account its mutual co-definition, and that the spiral emerges from and submerges back to 4. Then use your comprehension to answer the following question. If you think of all the moral philosophers and activists who contributed powerful ideas that we have collectively benefited from, and then look at the information available about their personal lives, actions, and feelings, how do we handle the fact of their own personal moral failings? Why did such people fall short of their own explicitly developed ideas? The image presents an Ubuntu-centered holographic framework where fundamental questions Ubuntu, when, where, what, why, who, how, all, radiate around a central cubioctahedron containing the numbers 1, 2, 1/2, 4, 2/1, 2, 1, with spirals emerging from and returning to 4, and a pattern showing overlapping circles creating a center of 4 surrounded by 2 seconds and 1 second. The equation 112 anchors the bottom. This framework suggests that consciousness and reality operate through recursive, holographic patterns where unity and duality generate complexity before returning to their source. A pattern echoed in Ubuntu's relational ontology where identity emerges through mutual co-definition. The spiral's journey from 4 back to 4 represents how differentiated consciousness returns to integrated wholeness through experience. The knowledge-action gap. Moral philosophers throughout history have articulated profound ethical insights while simultaneously failing to embody them in their personal lives. Kant developed the categorical imperative while holding deeply racist views that contradicted his own principle of universality. Rousseau wrote eloquently about proper child-rearing while abandoning his own children. Aristotle theorized about virtue while considering women deformed men and defending slavery. This pattern extends across philosophical traditions. Heidegger's Nazism, Wittgenstein's violence toward students, Hume's racism, and countless other examples reveal a troubling disconnect between philosophical brilliance and moral behavior. Understanding through the holographic framework. The holographic framework illuminates why this gap exists. Knowledge operates at one level of the spiral, the realm of abstract understanding, represented by the geometric structure's orderly patterns, while embodied action requires integration through all levels of consciousness back toward the center. The philosopher who grasps truth intellectually, moving outward on the spiral, may never complete the return journey that transforms understanding into lived reality. Consciousness without integration. The Ubuntu dimension of the diagram emphasizes that genuine understanding emerges through relational practice, through the movement between I, we, you and me, us, them. Philosophers who theorize about morality without engaging these relationships at the experiential level achieve only partial knowledge. They access the what content of moral theory, and perhaps the why justification, without integrating the who identity transformation and how embodied practice. The center of the overlapping circles shows 4 surrounded by 2 seconds and 1 second, suggesting that complete integration requires synthesizing multiple perspectives that remain separate for those who theorize without transformation. Moral philosophers who fail personally may understand morality at level 2, duality, abstraction, analysis, without achieving level 4, integrated wholeness. The role of consciousness structures. Contemporary discussions recognize that moral knowledge doesn't automatically generate moral motivation. Some philosophers even advocate Schillerian separation, the view that academic ethics should be divorced from personal behavior, treating moral philosophy as an intellectual game where one can explore radical conclusions without implementation. This perspective treats ethics as existing at the what level without requiring integration through who and how. However, this separation may itself reflect a cognitive limitation. The spiral emerges from 4 and returns to 4, suggesting that genuine understanding requires completing the full circuit, moving from integrated wholeness through differentiation and back to transformed integration. Philosophers who remain at the differentiated stage possess knowledge about morality without embodying moral wisdom. Why brilliant thinkers fall short. Several factors explain this pattern. First, intellectual understanding operates differently from embodied transformation. The philosopher develops sophisticated rational frameworks while leaving emotional patterns, habitual behaviors, and unconscious biases unexamined. They access one dimension of the holographic structure without integrating it through practice. Second, cultural conditioning creates blind spots that even rigorous analysis cannot always penetrate. Kant read travel reports and was warned about their unreliability, yet continued basing racial theories on them. The dominant cognitive frameworks of one's era constrain perception in ways that philosophical method alone cannot overcome without active engagement with alternative perspectives. Third, moral philosophy as an academic discipline may actually discourage integration. When ethics becomes primarily about producing publishable arguments rather than personal transformation, philosophers gain professional success by theorizing about morality rather than becoming moral. The institutional structure rewards differentiation, moving outward on the spiral without requiring the return journey. Fourth, akrasia, weakness of will, affects philosophers as much as anyone. Understanding what one ought to do doesn't automatically generate the motivation or capacity to do it. The transformation from level 2, knowing, to level 4, integrated being, requires more than intellectual comprehension. The Ubuntu perspective, from the Ubuntu framework emphasizing I, we, you, me, us, them, moral understanding genuinely exists only within relationships. Philosophers who theorize in isolation, even about community and justice, remain at the level of mine, ours, yours, without the transformative encounter with actual them that completes the circuit. Their theories remain abstractions that never undergo the testing and refinement that comes from embodied relational practice. The holographic principle suggests each part contains the whole. A philosopher who fails to integrate moral understanding into personal behavior reveals that their understanding itself remains partial. They possess fragments, 1 second and 2 seconds, without achieving the integrated wholeness from which genuine moral wisdom emerges and to which it returns. The recursive nature of moral development. The spiral's movement from 4 back to 4 indicates that moral development is not linear but recursive. Philosophers may achieve profound insights at certain moments while simultaneously harboring contradictory beliefs and behaviors. They exist at multiple points on the spiral simultaneously. Their intellectual achievements represent genuine progress on one dimension, while their personal failings reveal incompleteness on others. This suggests we should view moral philosophers neither as pure hypocrites nor as pure exemplars, but as beings caught in the same recursive developmental process affecting all consciousness. Their intellectual contributions have value even when their personal lives reveal limitations, because they have accessed genuine aspects of moral reality even without fully integrating them. Their failures, meanwhile, teach us that moral wisdom requires completing the entire circuit. That understanding divorced from practice remains incomplete. This helps me remember that every person has something beneficial to contribute, and at the same time, should never be idolized or have their genuine faults overlooked, including myself, because God knows I have my own faults to deal with. That recognition embodies the essence of Ubuntu. A person is a person through other persons, where mutual recognition includes acknowledging both contributions and limitations in oneself and others. This balanced perspective prevents two destructive extremes, dismissing people entirely because of their flaws, or elevating them to infallible status that denies their humanity. 1, 2, 3, 4. Mutual recognition and dignity. Ubuntu philosophy insists that every person possesses inherent dignity and worth regardless of their status or failings. This recognition extends equally to celebrating genuine contributions while refusing to overlook authentic shortcomings. The practice of respect within Ubuntu involves seeing people whole, neither reducing them to their worst moments, nor inflating them beyond their actual development. 5. 634. This framework aligns with the holographic principle where each person contains partial expressions of truth, the 1 second and 2 seconds, while remaining on the journey toward integrated wholeness. 4. Recognizing this in others makes it possible to receive their genuine insights without requiring them to be perfectly integrated beings first. 2. 7. The recursive journey. The spiral's movement from 4 back to 4 represents the ongoing developmental process affecting everyone simultaneously. Personal awareness of one's own position on this journey, having faults to deal with, as the recognition acknowledges, creates the intellectual humility necessary for wisdom. Research on wisdom consistently identifies this epistemic humility, recognizing the limits of one's own knowledge and development as essential for genuine insight. 8, 9, 7 reveal Solomon's paradox. People often demonstrate greater wisdom when reflecting on others' problems than their own. This suggests that seeing one's own developmental incompleteness requires particular effort, yet doing so enables more authentic engagement with both personal growth and others' contributions. Avoiding idolatry and dismissal. The Ubuntu framework provides protection against two forms of distortion. First, it prevents idolatry, treating any person as having reached permanent, complete integration while still embodied in the recursive process. Even those who offer profound insights remain on the developmental spiral, simultaneously holding wisdom and limitation. Second, it prevents dismissal, rejecting contributions because the contributor exhibits flaws. Since all persons exist within the recursive developmental process, requiring perfect integration before accepting insights would eliminate all human wisdom. The framework recognizes that partial truth, 1 second and 2 seconds, genuinely exists and has value even before achieving complete integration. Practical application. This balanced recognition shapes how to engage with both others and oneself. It enables receiving valuable insights from flawed sources, including historical philosophers, contemporary thinkers, spiritual teachers, and everyday people, without requiring they first demonstrate moral perfection. Simultaneously, it maintains ethical accountability by refusing to excuse harmful behaviors even in those who contribute beneficial ideas. Applied to oneself, this perspective fosters genuine growth. Acknowledging personal faults without collapsing into self-condemnation creates the conditions for actual transformation. The holographic framework shows this isn't mere self-acceptance, but accurate self-perception, recognizing current position on the spiral while remaining oriented toward the integration that draws all development. Communal accountability. Ubuntu's communal dimension ensures this balanced perspective functions in relationship rather than isolation. Individuals hold one another accountable, naming both contributions and failings, while maintaining recognition of shared humanity and ongoing development. This creates space for restorative justice, truth-telling, and collective growth that individualistic frameworks cannot sustain. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa exemplified this, acknowledging terrible wrongs while maintaining that perpetrators retained human dignity and capacity for transformation. This wasn't minimizing harm, but recognizing that both victims and perpetrators existed within the same developmental framework, requiring both accountability and opportunity for genuine change. The recognition expressed, That everyone has something beneficial to contribute while no one should be idolized or have faults overlooked, including oneself, captures the practical wisdom Ubuntu offers for navigating the recursive developmental journey we all share. Still, we can't help but to be disappointed sometimes by others. I think this pain is legitimate and should be acknowledged. This grief when someone's respected reputation dies within our perception, or when ours dies in the perception of others, even our own. Maybe that is why it is said that forgiveness is divine. The disappointment and grief accompanying the collapse of a respected reputation, whether another's in one's perception, one's own in others' eyes, or even within one's own self-regard, represents authentic loss that warrants acknowledgement. Philosophy has increasingly recognized that some emotions feel bad yet remain profoundly important to experience and express, with disappointment and grief falling precisely into this category. The pain signals something genuine about human relationality and the nature of moral aspiration, the legitimacy of moral disappointment. Contemporary philosophy of emotion argues that disappointment deserves recognition as a morally significant response rather than dismissal as excessive or inappropriate. Social practices that suppress or minimize disappointment when encountering moral failings, whether in respected figures or oneself, actually undermine the capacity to feel this emotion well and process it authentically. The grief arising from shattered perceptions reflects the death of an idealized image that held genuine value in one's meaning-making framework. Research on grief reveals it functions as the container that holds all of the emotions felt as a result of loss. When a reputation dies, externally or internally, this constitutes a legitimate loss, the loss of expectations, hopes, and the relationship that existed with that image. Grief registers the emotional reality of this loss regardless of whether the image was ever fully accurate. Reputation damage as psychological wound. The psychological impact of reputation damage proves substantial and measurable. Studies show that perceived reputation loss predicts increased depressive symptoms, particularly for individuals who value social standing highly. The stress manifests as anxiety about consequences, loss of self-esteem, social isolation, and, in severe cases, risk of suicide, especially among middle-aged males experiencing actual or threatened reputation damage. 8. This applies whether the reputation loss concerns oneself or admired others. The psychological wound stems from several sources: the violation of trust, the shattering of meaning structures built around the person's perceived character, and the recognition of vulnerability in one's own judgment or integrity. The pain acknowledges that reputations matter. They serve essential functions in social coordination, identity formation, and moral community. The holographic framework on loss. The holographic cosmogram illuminates why this grief feels so profound. When a reputation dies, multiple dimensions collapse simultaneously. At the who level, identity, both of the fallen figure and of those who identified with them, undergoes disruption. At the what level, cherished ideas become tainted by association with their flawed proponent. At the why level, purposes and meanings constructed around the person's perceived virtue require reconstruction. The Ubuntu dimension reveals the relational nature of this loss. A reputation exists not as isolated fact but as shared understanding within we. It forms part of the mutual recognition through which persons constitute one another. When reputation collapses, the relational fabric tears, affecting all participants in the recognition structure. This explains why disappointment in others often feels like personal betrayal. It genuinely disrupts the relational field through which identity and meaning emerge. Forgiveness as divine. The statement, "Forgiveness is divine," captures something profound about consciousness structure. Research on divine forgiveness, forgiveness from a higher power, consistently associates it with psychological well-being, suggesting it addresses needs at fundamental levels. But what makes forgiveness divine rather than merely human? The holographic framework suggests an answer. Forgiveness requires operating from the integrated center 4 rather than from the differentiated positions 1 second and 2 seconds where offense and judgment occur. At level 2, one sees duality, perpetrator versus victim, failing versus ideal, reputation versus reality. Genuine forgiveness transcends this dualistic perception without denying the distinctions. It recognizes both the offense and the humanity of the offender from a more integrated perspective. This capacity feels divine because it mirrors the recursive structure of consciousness itself, the movement from unity 1 through differentiation 2 to integrated wholeness 4 and back. Forgiveness enacts the return journey, acknowledging the differentiated reality of harm while reintegrating the fractured relationship into a larger wholeness. This doesn't erase the harm or excuse the failing, but recognizes both perpetrator and victim as existing within the same developmental spiral, moving toward integration. Forgiveness across dimensions. Different spiritual traditions emphasize distinct aspects of this structure. Divine forgiveness from God represents forgiveness from the center of the holographic structure, from the position of complete integration 4, looking toward all the partially developed positions 1 second and 2 seconds. This explains why many describe divine forgiveness as unconditional yet transformative. It sees the person whole rather than reduced to their worst action. Interpersonal forgiveness attempts to embody this same movement at the human level, to see the other from a more integrated position than the wounded ego occupies. Self-forgiveness requires, perhaps the most difficult movement, viewing oneself from the integrated center rather than from the position of the internalized judge. Each type involves the same structural movement, the return spiral from differentiation back toward wholeness. Processing the grief. The legitimacy of grief when reputations die suggests certain responses prove more integrative than others. First, acknowledging the loss as genuine rather than minimizing it creates space for authentic processing. The disappointment signals that something valued has been lost. The image, the relationship with that image, the meanings constructed around it. Second, distinguishing between the idealized image and the actual person helps clarify what specifically was lost. Often the grief mourns not the person as they are, but the person as imagined. Recognizing this distinction allows appreciation of genuine contributions while releasing the unrealistic expectations. Third, understanding grief as process rather than state acknowledges that emotional responses evolve through stages requiring time and attention. Fitting grief may attenuate as one integrates the loss and reconstructs meaning around more realistic perceptions. This doesn't mean the initial grief was inappropriate, but that it rightfully transforms as consciousness processes the experience. Fourth, recognizing one's own position on the developmental spiral prevents both harsh judgment and naive idealization. Both the person whose reputation collapsed and oneself exist at various points on the journey from differentiation toward integration. This shared developmental reality grounds both appropriate accountability and genuine compassion. 11. The divine capacity within. If forgiveness is divine, this suggests something profound. The capacity for forgiveness reflects participation in the divine nature, in the integrated consciousness from which the spiral emerges and to which it returns. The difficulty of forgiveness reveals how challenging it is to operate from integrated wholeness rather than wounded differentiation. Yet the Ubuntu framework insists this capacity exists within relational practice. Forgiveness emerges not through isolated individual effort, but through the we space where persons encounter each other authentically. The disappointment and grief, when honored rather than suppressed, create the conditions for this deeper encounter. They signal that something genuine was at stake, that care existed, and that integration remains possible. The pain of disappointed expectations and collapsed reputations thus serves a purpose beyond mere suffering. It marks the territory where transformation becomes possible, where the movement from differentiation back toward wholeness can genuinely occur. I suppose then, the betrayal by a person of an ideal doesn't necessarily mean the ideal itself should be betrayed. Precisely. The betrayal of an ideal by its advocate constitutes a separate category of failure from the validity of the ideal itself. This distinction proves essential for navigating the disappointment when respected figures fall short. It allows acknowledging the failure without abandoning the truth they articulated. The independence of ideals. Ideals function as models of excellence that exist independently of particular persons who advocate for them. A substantive ideal, such as justice, compassion, or intellectual honesty, presents standards against which actions and character can be assessed, regardless of who articulates the standard. The personalist philosophical tradition explicitly addresses this. Surrendering an ideal for a friend debases both oneself and the respect of the friend. To abandon truth because its messenger proves flawed actually dishonors both the truth and the relationship. Religious traditions emphasize this separation between message and messenger. The challenge involves learning to separate God's truth from imperfect messengers, recognizing that divine or universal truths maintain their validity even when conveyed through flawed human channels. This doesn't excuse the messenger's failings but preserves the integrity of what they genuinely understood. The holographic framework on truth. The holographic cosmogram illuminates why this distinction matters structurally. Truth exists at the level of the integrated center, the unified consciousness from which the spiral emerges. Individual persons occupy various positions along the developmental spiral, accessing aspects of this central truth from their particular vantage points. A philosopher or moral leader may genuinely perceive truth at the level of what content or why principle without having integrated it through who identity and how embodied practice. When such a person betrays the ideal, they reveal their developmental incompleteness, their position at level 2, understanding truth conceptually, rather than level 4, embodying truth integratively. But the truth they articulated came from the center, not from their partial developmental position. The ideal remains valid because it originates from the integrated whole, even though the messenger accessed it only partially. Ubuntu and relational truth. The Ubuntu dimension, I, we, you, me, us, them, reveals that truth emerges through relationship rather than isolated individual achievement. When a moral teacher articulates genuine insight, they participate in a larger relational field that transcends their individual development. The truth they speak belongs to the we space, not merely to the I 564. This explains why their personal betrayal of the ideal doesn't invalidate it. The ideal exists in the communal, relational dimension that exceeds any individual's capacity to fully embody. Others can continue building on genuine insights even after the original articulator falls away. The Ubuntu framework actually expects this. It recognizes that a person is a person through other persons, meaning truth develops through collective engagement rather than depending on any single exemplar. Practical wisdom. This distinction generates several practical principles. First, evaluating ideas on their own merits, rather than through ad hominem reasoning, prevents both inappropriate dismissal and uncritical acceptance. The question becomes, is this insight true, rather than is this person perfect? 3. Second, maintaining moral accountability for advocates without discarding their contributions honors both justice and truth. The lawyer ethics literature discusses this as moral independence, the principle that representing or engaging with flawed persons doesn't constitute endorsement of their failings. Similarly, learning from morally compromised philosophers doesn't require defending their personal behavior. 8, 9, 10, 111. Third, recognizing that ideals often conflict with each other prevents the pursuit of a single totalizing vision that Isaiah Berlin warned against. Different ideals: justice versus mercy, individual freedom versus communal solidarity, truth versus kindness represent genuine but sometimes incompatible values requiring wisdom to balance. No single person or system perfectly integrates all ideals simultaneously. 12. 3. Fourth, understanding that accessing truth doesn't automatically generate the capacity to embody it explains the knowledge-action gap discussed earlier. Recognizing this gap in others makes it possible to receive their insights while acknowledging their limitations. Recognizing it in oneself creates space for growth rather than paralysis. 11. 1. The recursive nature of truth-seeking. The spiral's movement from 4 back to 4 represents how truth-seeking operates recursively. Each generation, each thinker, each person accesses aspects of truth from their developmental position, contributes what they can genuinely perceive, and passes the work to others who continue the journey. The failures of previous contributors don't erase their valid contributions. They simply mark the limits of what those individuals achieved before falling away. 4. This creates continuity across generations, despite individual moral failings. Aristotle's insights into virtue ethics retain value despite his defenses of slavery. Kant's categorical imperative illuminates moral reasoning despite his racism. The civil rights leaders who articulated profound truths about justice and human dignity made genuine contributions even where their personal lives showed inconsistencies. The spiral continues, each person adding their partial vision to the collective journey toward integrated wholeness, preserving ideals through betrayal. Paradoxically, witnessing the betrayal of ideals by their advocates can actually strengthen commitment to the ideals themselves. Seeing that even brilliant moral philosophers fail to fully embody their insights reveals that the ideals exist beyond human achievement. They function as orienting stars rather than attainable destinations. This can deepen appreciation for the difficulty of moral life while maintaining the value of striving toward excellence. The personalist tradition emphasizes that values connect individuals to God or the supreme continuum. Man has a relation to God, the supreme continuum, as long as he seeks to realize the values in his life that are consistent with the supreme continuum. The ideals originate from the integrated center which transcends any individual's developmental position. Betrayal by advocates thus reveals the gap between human limitation and transcendent truth, potentially inspiring greater humility and dedication rather than cynical abandonment. The recognition that the betrayal by a person of an ideal doesn't necessarily mean the ideal itself should be betrayed protects against reactive disillusionment. It enables continuing the work of moral and spiritual development despite the inevitable failures of teachers, leaders, and oneself. Recognizing that all remain on the recursive journey from differentiation back toward the integrated wholeness from which genuine ideals emerge and toward which they perpetually call.